Hello there. So today in this presentation, we'll be looking at a poem called The Bus by Arun Kolatkar. Now, he was a bilingual poet who wrote in Marathi and English, and his 1976 collection, Jejuri, is set in the real-life pilgrimage town of the same name. And The Bus is the opening poem of this collection, and it really sets the tone for everything else that follows. Now, his poetry was often experimental, and he lived as a recluse, not really publishing his poetry until later in life. You can see some details on the screen here. And impressively, he's one of only two Indian poets to be included on the World Classics titles of the New York Review of Books. So now to the poem itself. On the surface, this is really just a bus ride. It's a bumpy ascent in the darkness. But just like the journey, this poem's about movement between two states: darkness and light, belief and skepticism, the ordinary and the divine. So let's take a listen first to the poem, and then we can analyse it a bit further. The tarpaulin flaps are buttoned down on the windows of the state transport bus, all the way up to Jejuri. A cold wind keeps whipping and slapping a corner of tarpaulin at your elbow. You look down to the roaring road. You search for the signs of daybreak in what little light spills out of bus. Your own divided face in the pair of glasses on an old man's nose is all the countryside you get to see. You seem to move continually forward toward a destination just beyond the cast mark, beyond his eyebrows. Outside, the sun has risen quietly. It aims through an eyelet in the tarpaulin and shoots at the old man's glasses. A sawed-off sunbeam comes to rest gently against the driver's right temple. The bus seems to change direction. At the end of the bumpy ride, with your own face on the either side, when you get off the bus, you don't step into the old man's head. Okay, so let's start off with a little bit of context here. I think that might be helpful. To put you into in the picture, he's heading to the shrine of Khandoba, which is a temple in the town of Jejuri. Now, Kolatkar knows this well, as he's from the state where Jejuri is located. However, he creates an uncomfortable tone at the start because he thinks about the world around him rather than his own spiritual journey. So let's have a look at the first section. So right from the very beginning, we're placed inside the bus. The tarpaulin, you can see a picture of it on the right there, covering of the side of the bus, takes the place of a normal window. This shows us the age of the bus, but it also acts as a barrier to seeing the outside world. It seems pretty uncomfortable as the tarpaulin flaps during this wet evening. Note too how the poem's speaker is really Kolatkar, but he refers to himself in the second person, often using you or your. Now this removes him from the scene a little and helps him reflect on the overall situation. It's also quite voyeuristic, like he's looking at you and describing what you're doing. Now, as well as the windows being buttoned down, he can feel the cold wind whipping and slapping, both onomatopoeic verbs that help to emphasize the uncomfortable nature of this journey. Now, the speaker stares down the roaring road using alliteration and also an unusual personification, because we don't tend to think of roads as roaring. We usually connect that with dangerous animals, which creates a slightly cautious, wary tone. A little light makes its way into the bus, but the speaker doesn't sound very hopeful that more will arrive. The use of sibilants in the words search for signs and spills into bus reflect the noise of the bus as it moves along. And by starting the previous line and this one with the phrase you look and you search, we're also given an image of somebody trying to find something beyond their reach. Now, in the next section, the focus shifts on to another passenger. Although the speaker is clearly looking for something, he ends up staring at his own divided reflection in the pair of glasses on an old man's nose. And this is a fairly obvious symbol of India as a divided country, but also of the speaker himself as someone who's trying to deal with his own religious beliefs, but also his modern outlook on the world. And the speaker seems a little uncertain about how he feels or how he thinks he should feel about this journey. Words like "you seem to move continually forward" in the next line add a touch of uncertainty about whether he's moving forward. Maybe he is literally, but not metaphorically. Now, the caste mark, and you can see this on the right, on the man's head is a strong religious symbol, possibly contrasting with the speaker's own beliefs, which are a bit less certain. And therefore, both men are heading to the same destination, but for different reasons. And while this is happening, the sun continues to rise. Note how the verbs aims and shoots work to personify the sun. What should be a positive image, the sun coming up, only adds more tension with these words, which obviously have connotations of weapons and violence. And this continues over into the next line with the sawed-off sunbeam, which reminds us really only of a sawn-off shotgun. And again, there's more tension here as the light rests on the driver's head or right temple, exactly how a sniper may line up a shot with like laser precision. This is just his job. The bus seems to be a microcosm of Indian society, with people heading to the same place for different reasons. Some may be religious, some may be tourists, some may be working. And all this work with light and sun is a particularly visual image, which isn't surprising as Kolatkar works in cinema for a while. It's another example also of how he expertly controls the light and dark so well in this poem. The speaker's own uncertainty is seen again in the next line. The bus seems to change direction. The you in this poem doesn't seem to mind, though, and stays on right until the end. And finally, we do arrive at the final stop on this bumpy ride. Again, the adjective bumpy describes the physical nature journey, but also the awkward nature of being around these passengers. Because you may have noticed, although there are many people on the bus, there's no interaction with anyone, adding to the slightly strange atmosphere. And similar to the stilted silence on the bus, even the phrase with your own face on the either side doesn't really flow well or naturally. You get off the bus, but there's no indication the temple is nearby, which means there isn't a sense that your journey is over. And also, to be fair, this is the start of a collection of 31 poems, so it actually isn't over. And then the final kind of disjointed phrase tells us you don't step inside the old man's head. Maybe a more familiar phrase would be that you don't follow in his footsteps. We can imagine the old man walking off to the temple, but you don't follow, and instead choose a different path. It's fairly easy to see here how that symbolizes the speaker not following the past traditions and religions, and instead striking out on their own, which links to the wider themes here. If you've read Robert Frost's brilliant The Road Not Taken, you may have got a similar kind of message. Okay, now let's move on, look a little bit at the structure and form of this poem, the shape of it. As we've talked about, it's a pretty bumpy ride on this bus in every sense, so maybe it's not surprising that the shape of the poem reflects this. It's written in a fairly meandering free verse style, so there's no rhyme scheme or meter to be looking for here. If we're thinking more deeply, we could also consider why Kolatkar writes in free verse. Essentially, he's not following the rules of poetry, and in a similar way, the person on the bus is not following the traditional, normal religious pathways, and is more of a free spirit. So that style does make sense. We could say there are roughly 3 lines to each stanza, but even that's not actually always true. Even then, there are many enjambments where one line runs onto the next, such as when the wind keeps whipping and slapping. It's easy to hear the sound of the tarpaulin flying one way and then coming back again, much like how this line works. The hard consonants, the P sound, also helps us hear that tarpaulin more clearly, the whipping and slapping. And the 3-line stanzas are clearly short, a bit like someone whose thoughts are jumping from one vision to the next, much like, I guess, when we're on a bus and are distracted by something briefly. And choosing to write in the second person voice is quite unusual for poems. Usually you see it hear it in pop songs. So why does he do it like this then? I think it deliberately pulls the reader into the bus on the journey and makes them feel like one of the characters. Or it could be the speaker is describing his experience in a slightly more detached kind of way. Now let's move on and look at some of the symbolism that is happening here in the poem, because there is quite a lot of it. Really 4 main things I want to focus on. The windows are the most obvious first symbol here. They are designed to stop light, which could represent truth from getting inside the bus. And because the speaker can't see what's going on, it creates that feeling of discomfort and mistrust about this journey that the other passengers perhaps don't feel. Now, when the sunlight does come, and let's continue with the idea that it represents religious truth or knowledge, it feels more like a weapon than something comforting. It shoots and aims, not quite what we expect. But then the speaker isn't feeling very enlightened, and this lack of light represents this. Another example of how light is used cleverly here is the reflection in the old man's glasses. This divided image shows how the speaker's face in both lenses, symbolizing his uncertain feelings about this journey, really. He's in two minds about things. It also shows how the speaker isn't engaging with anyone. Rather than looking at the man wearing the glasses, he simply sees himself. Perhaps one day he'll look back and see himself as an old man in someone else's glasses. Another reason to feel a bit anxious and awkward, maybe. And then lastly, the bus itself, I guess, could also be seen as a symbol. It carries on through the night with any real sense of where it's heading, thanks to the tarpaulin covering everything all around him. Carrying on regardless without any sense of direction and purpose. Doesn't that sound a bit like the speaker himself? So, overall, we have a poem here about someone on a bus who is going on a journey, but it's different from those around him who are on more of a pilgrimage. This person, presented as you, has a much more uncertain, awkward journey that he knows will be different from those around him. So there we go. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe.